The Child's Play movies have made an impact in the horror genre and managed to rank him as an iconic character, such as people like Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, Michael Myers, Ghostface, and so on and so forth. And has managed to make the franchise which he's a part of quite iconic, like Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, and so on and so forth. Yet unlike other classics, this one is goofy as shit, yet still managed to have a fan base which tries to intellectually praise the movie. And they fail. I think reviewing Curse of Chucky kinda requires an analysis of the franchise itself. Now this is the moment where everyone flips their shit. Daring to criticise and poke holes in the series leaves you left with fans ready to harp on you for insulting the franchise, and reducing it to what the fans like to view it as a horror classic. People don't actually like looking at the flaws of the movie because analysing the flaws can destroy the movie for some people. And I think the problem really comes down to liking movies and your need to try and intellectually appreciate it. Why can't you just enjoy a movie for it being good? Now the first movie was alright, but it's not something I'd rank as a perfect movie. The idea itself was fairly goofy and could have been way better than the final result. I mean, first off, the dialogue scenes don't really work that well.
Oh god, I'm dying.
Acting. And it's not as if they got a bad actor to do this either. They got Brad Dourif. And the voodoo man Chucky was friends with, John, would not only befriend a serial killer and teach him voodoo, but also keep a voodoo doll of himself laying around. It seems like a setup for disaster to begin with, being friends with a killer, but then just leaving a doll that they could kill you with laying around. And this.
I have a date with a 6-year-old boy.
And let's just face it, the premise itself is stupid, and this is mainly one of the biggest points against the first movie. The idea of going out and saying, fuck it, we'll just show everyone it's a doll, and not leave it up to interpretation is probably one of the biggest flaws they did. They shut off so many creative doors to actually explore. If they explored this, we could have gotten a more intelligent screenplay. In fact, initially watching the Child's Play movies, I thought it was a parody movie of a movie with a similar premise. Except the movie they were parodying was most likely more intelligently done. But as shown, I was wrong. And that's how I really view the first three movies. They shouldn't be taken 100% seriously when viewing because they take a goofy premise and fail at making it scary. So like it for what it's worth. A comedy. And this is where the controversy will really shine. I prefer Bride of Chucky and Seed of Chucky over the first three movies, and my reason being is that they're self-aware. They're fucking comedies. I keep seeing these movies being discredited because they're not scary. Why? They're supposed to be self-parodies. I mean, it's kinda obvious that after the third one they acknowledged the goofiness of the franchise and then went with it rather than keeping the straight face. Bride and Seed of Chucky was self-aware and they used that to factor in so many jokes and references, and they did it well for a comedy. Making something which leaves the series with, in my opinion, a high note and making an entertaining close off to a goofy series. Then Curse of Chucky comes along, fucks up the high note. One of the many things people advertised and credited this movie for was going back to its roots. They claim that they're going back to the good old days, when Chucky was truly scary.
Fans really want Chucky to be scary again.
I think Chucky's scarier than he's been in a long time because we don't know where he is. He's in the background somewhere. And I think those are the moments that were truly scary in the Chucky franchise.
But was he? As I said before, the first three movies weren't that good, and people say they are. Though I do think most people dislike asking this question because people will end up bombarded with a ludicrous amount of hate just for daring to ask the question. Was Chucky as scary as people make him out to be? I'm sorry to say, but the first three movies aren't flawless. As said before, I think having mystery to it would have been more scary, and even to add to it, they could have shown the actual characters losing their tact on reality, showing their lives being fucked up and tarnished due to their own insanity. Revealing the killer as Chucky destroyed a lot of potential plot lines. That part where Chucky went past, that could have been Andy. In fact, it could have been any kid in general who just broke into the house. A midget. Who knows? You could have fleshed out the story way more than it came out of if the creators were more willing to take more time with the movie. Though I'm not saying that it couldn't have been scary knowing that the doll was the killer, but I don't think Child's Play really hit the nail. The idea of a doll being a killer in and of itself is a bit of a far-fetched idea, but it could work. But hey, what's done is done. And Curse of Chucky wasn't completely bad. At times. But just like the original, this one also had its flaws. Like how the jump scares are predictable as holy fuck. It also seemed weird how Chucky had a few opportunities to kill yet never pursued them. Like when he and Nico were in the same room and he was just starting the car. Why didn't he just fucking kill her? I mean, she's in a fucking wheelchair and she passes out due to extreme stress. Just grab a knife and fucking kill her! Wasn't there another character in the Child's Play series that had stress problems, and what happened to him again? Also, why is it when he electrocutes Jill, only one of her eyes starts to swell and the other's perfectly okay? You know, I'm pretty sure if one eye is swollen then the other would too. It just seems a bit inconsistent. Also, when she cut off his head with an axe, there was no gore. Like, what the fuck? In the other movies, there's been gores when he's been shot or stabbed. Why do you think he has no flesh around his eyes? You know, these are usually mistakes smart filmmakers catch on during the writing process. They're not usually stuff that ends up being in the final product. The flaws in these movies can be explained by two simple words. Plot convenience. Why didn't Chucky take the opportunity to kill Nika, so Nika could be at the end to wrap the movie up nice and good, which I'll get to later. Why did Chucky's head not bleed, instead have the insides of a regular toy, despite the franchise showing that if a body part is cut off, blood comes out with it? So he could pick up his head and throw off the audience. But given the entire franchise showing he bleeds, people are either assuming you suck at continuity or something's going to happen at the convenience of the plot. At the very least, you could have actually gave a reason as to why it occurred. It's never happened before in the favour of the plot. Usually they just think of a more tangible idea. Not once in the movie have they ever copped out showing you blood whenever Chucky's harmed. The first movie had the tar burn, the gunshots, setting him on fire. The second movie had the nosebleeds, his hand being ripped off and then replaced with a knife, and then he explodes. The third movie had his face sliced off, his arm shot, stabbed several times, and his hand cut off. Bride of Chucky had him stitched back and then shot to death, and Seed of Chucky had him hacked to death, so, you know, seems a bit fucking weird that all of a sudden he can just switch from having blood inside of him to no blood. Seems like a huge shift given that the blood was supposed to show him turning into a human.
More time you spend in that body, more human you become.
If you want to throw off the audience and make it seem like Chucky died, you could have just hacked off part of his head. Then in the foreground you could see him pulling out the axe. Why couldn't you have done that? Bear in mind, this is the same killer that survived all this other shit in the previous movies. What cohesive argument do you have in getting decapitated but having no blood? A lot of these plot convenience could have been easily solved by the writers looking at the script and saying, hey, is there a way to work around this? It's not difficult. Usually creative writers would be able to do this type of stuff to clear up this shit. And since most people that like Chucky movies also give the movie credit for being smart, then maybe you should answer us why these movies have so painfully noticeable scenes which are only there to serve the plot later on. It would seem like a movie which would like to define as a very smart movie would take the time out of their day to pace it out and look at all these flaws and consider better ways to do certain things. You know, add all this stuff to where it's subtle and not in your fucking face. You know, what it's supposed to do. Also, the jump scares. My god. The whole purpose of a jump scare is to make you jump out of your seats. You didn't see it coming. You don't expect it. Nowadays, a jump scare is essentially someone suspects something in a discreet room. They go look at the room, accompany them with a slow, suspenseful music which slowly builds up. As she goes near the location, someone comes up or an inanimate object makes a noise with a loud, piercing measure of orchestral music as she sighs off the event. Then the killer attacks. It's so fucking predictable that the jump scares have lost its meaning. Personally, I say fuck jump scares. Jump scares are cheap. If you need to rely on them for the most part of your movie, then that just goes to show your ability to incorporate actual fear into a horror movie. Not to say that anyone who uses them doesn't know horror, a jump scare can play out well if you actually know how to make them work. But I'd actually like to see a horror movie which can actually be terrifying without having to throw in a jump scare or a freaky looking killer. Maybe learn that the payoff is usually less scary than the actual suspense that accompanies it. Ongoing anxiety about the event occurring is usually what scares the audience, not the payoff. The context is what truly matters, and I'm not saying don't use a jump scare, but in this movie they make it a continuous thing. As said, a jump scare shouldn't be predictable. That's the whole point. But I've been giving this movie some flack for quite some time now, but the movie itself isn't entirely shit. For example, one thing I appreciate about this movie is the new perspective of Chucky. You know that little kid, Alice? I like that she's underplayed a lot of the seriousness that the rest had. It gave us something new to see in a Chucky movie instead of just giving her the Andy formula, which was essentially the first 3 movies. It gave us something new to the table which was rather interesting. I mean, the kid never suspected he'd be the one to kill and never actually saw it. She had no reason to be scared of him. But given how Andy and Tyler, the guy from the 3rd movie, end up being scared of him at the end, it gave this movie a unique feeling to it rather than just being a rehash of the 1st movie with a different location and cast. Giving a character, especially a main one, a new way to feel about Chucky was a nice feel, and the story was also pretty good and was able to make up for a lot of the flaws in it. The way it was very clever and actually had some relevancy, and though the jump scares were very painfully predictable, the movie was still played out alright. But that's it. It's alright. People overhype the fuck out of this series. It's not as great as you think. And this is really what I wanted to get at. This series is grossly overrated. And bear in mind, overrated doesn't necessarily mean bad. But in this case, it's not as if it's an intellectual piece of movie art. The reason why movies like A Clockwork Orange are praised is due to its ability to convey a message with subtlety instead of it flashing in your face. If it wanted a message out, it would have been placed in the movie intelligently. They also knew how to make a movie which would make you think and entertain you at the same time. The Child's Play franchise is entertaining, no doubt about that, but it's not really that intellectual. I mean, if you want to praise it for being entertaining, then knock yourself out. But to call it intelligent is insulting. The Child's Play franchise is something, at least to me, which I watch to be entertained. It's an alright franchise, but it's not something I'd rank for its substance. It's very cliche. I do give credit though. The movies do have flaws, and I really do have to give the movie credit because even though it does have flaws, it can still be entertaining and enjoyable. But this is up to interpretation. Some people will be able to withstand the flaws in the movie and some will go apeshit. But take it from an overcritical nut like me, I was able to watch it. What mostly bugs me is the people that hype this movie. It's bad enough to be dumb, but it's even worse watching a dumb person trying to explain something in a movie that isn't there, purely just to give the movie more than what it is. No, you don't understand. This movie is really artistic because... insert half-baked reason here. No. If you like the movie, then just say you like the fucking movie. I think that a lot of long-time fans really like this movie due to nostalgia, but even then I don't get it. People usually justify cheesy horror movies because I just wasn't there in the 80s to truly understand the mindset of them back then, as to why they were so scared. I understand the mindset, but it's still fucking dumb. Well, I'm sorry, they have no excuse. The Exorcist was made in 1973 and that was scary. People today still get scared by that movie. It doesn't matter about when the movie was made, it has nothing to do with a lack of special effects because The Exorcist had pretty basic effects. This movie just wasn't that scary. If you're making a horror movie, make the movie horrific, and make the audience fear it. People hate the comedic adaptations of the movie after the 3rd Chucky movie, but I think they took a smart route. The movie was already goofy as shit, and there was no saving it. And the reason why people like Curse of Chucky is because it essentially just feeds the audience what they want. And that's my biggest problem with the movie. It's fan service. The actors can say all they want, how they've really captured the scariness that the original movie had and how it's super scary now. But the baseline is that they wanted a movie that they could make money with and please the fans who were dissatisfied with Seed of Chucky. They realised since no one likes Seed of Chucky, they decided to use that to their own advantage. It doesn't matter if the movie is just fan service. It doesn't matter if the characters were kind of underdeveloped. It doesn't matter if Chucky doesn't look the same way he did in previous movies. It doesn't matter that Chucky decided against opportunities to kill his victims when he clearly had no other reason not to other than the fact that they could just be fed dialogue which feeds the fans. It doesn't matter if there's so many holes in the movie which are only there for plot convenience despite there being ways to get around it which wouldn't fucking contradict the story. All of that shit doesn't matter to the fans. If you're able to connect the dots and wrap the movie with something which ties in the previous movies and gives a backstory to the murderer, the fans will just eat that shit up and not question anything. even if the movie does have flaws which are so painfully obvious that only someone who was just refusing to look at the evidence wouldn't be able to notice it. These days, people don't care about the substance in a story, so long as you're able to give them a character they care about and expand their backstory. No one gives a shit if there's holes in the stories. The problem with fan service is that it takes you out of the movie and is just trying to please you. It's essentially flashing lights. Yeah, it's fun to see every now and then, but not for 2 hours. The reason why people like Curse of Chucky is because it plays to the audience. It's a huge nostalgia fest. It gives them a movie which expands upon Chucky before he was a doll. It explains other stuff and shows past characters as a way to make the audience happy and go, gasp! I know that person. He was in the original movie. Wow, this movie really knows how to pay homage. Just flashing old characters into a 2-hour movie is fine to imagine with your friends, but it's not something that should actually be made into a movie. But here's the thing. The problem with explaining a villain's backstory in a horror movie is that it's a double-edged sword. It either makes your villain better, or in this instance, it kinda ruins the feel to it. One franchise which I could really describe this perfectly is The Nightmare on Elm Street. It ended off with 2 movies, Freddy's Dead and Wes Craven New Nightmare. It's nice to compare the two because on one hand, Freddy's Dead was an awful way to close off the series, whereas New Nightmare did it perfectly. Though New Nightmare's ending was a little goofy, it gets a pass because the movie itself had a decent premise and was a good way to close off the series with a good movie. Freddy's one of those horror characters with certain elements in his backstory that should be left untold. It's like taking Heath Ledger's Joker and saying, hey, we've never really told everything about his past. Maybe we should do that. No, you shouldn't. Sometimes certain villains don't need an elaborate and detailed backstory. Sometimes you shouldn't expand their backstory solely for the benefit of cashing on a popular movie. Maybe if you want to get your audience's attention, you should make a good sequel to a movie, which has a good plot instead of a nostalgia fest of characters from old movies and explain backstory of Chucky. Yeah, talk all you want how Seed of Chucky was a terrible movie and how Curse of Chucky was really scary. But at least Seed of Chucky was actually worth watching. Yeah, rag on the movie all you want, but it definitely stood for what it promised. And you know what? Seed of Chucky was actually pretty funny about going about it. Curse of Chucky intends to be a scary horror movie, but it doesn't really seem to try at times. It did have some suspenseful scenes, like when Ian had Nika tied up and he was looking at the camera attached to Chucky, slowly realizing Chucky was moving by him and was alive, then turning on the cam to live cam, seeing him right where they were. But even that had its flaw. I don't care who the person is. If the live cam says the doll you just found out was alive and talking was right behind you, it wouldn't take you seconds after to get up. No human being would do that. There's having a dumb person in a horror movie and then there's just lazy writing. One flaw with a movie is that with every good thing that comes to the movie, there's always a flaw which makes you scratch your head in confusement. You know when you see a movie with so many flaws and you have the reaction of, hey, I could do way better than this. That's how you'll probably feel watching this movie. The thing is, there's so many flaws that could have been easily worked around with an updated script. This is something I couldn't stress enough. The mistakes in these movies don't always outweigh the good parts in this movie, but they do have a tendency to do that. And it's not like all of these are minor mistakes which tend to occur in movies. Even movies that I like do have their fair share of mistakes in them, but these are mistakes you'd expect to see in a college movie. And speaking of points to stress, the budget. I didn't even have to know the budget watching this movie for a first time to know that it had a poor budget. But even when doing research, I was proven more correct. If you're working on a low budget, at least make it work. I've seen movies that were filmed with a low budget, and sometimes even lower than this movie, that have managed to work with what they had and did a great job. The animatronics in this movie were worse than the original. Yeah. A lot of the effects seem to be invested in the death scenes, which I do give credit for, admittedly looked realistic. But they spent so much time on how to make the decapitations look realistic and people's jaws being hacked off, that they didn't even fucking try to make Chucky, you know, the main character, more realistic. They also didn't know how to make him realistic without a big budget. Atmosphere. If you made him look somewhat passable and gave him some atmosphere, this movie could have worked out greatly. The issue is, the movie was clearly rushed. It seemed to try too hard to appeal to what horrors became rather than how the series was. And this is the biggest flaw. It's not child's play. People make this out to be better than Bride and Seed because it's going back to its roots, but it really didn't. From an outsider perspective, it just looks like a generic horror movie. You don't leave it saying, wow, this movie was unique and unlike a lot of other horror movies. When I say the movie is nostalgic, it's clearly due to the former characters, not the actual style. The style just seems like other modern horror movies. Get a supernatural killer and a bunch of dumb victims who are generally just eye candy, incorporate a fuck ton of jump scares, and gore, gore, gore! If you're gonna market yourself as going back to the original, then go back to the original. This movie tried to be the original by going back to this backstory, and failed. Final rating, 6 out of 10. The movie had a fuck ton of avoidable flaws, very forgettable characters, plot conveniences out of the ass which weren't even needed, dumb victims, and was essentially fan service, and a bunch of other flaws. But if you can sift through that, there is some alright scenes, and the backstory wasn't too bad, but I felt that it was only there to give context to the new characters, rather than to serve a purpose. It seemed out of nowhere and forced upon us. The scenes before, showing the family tapes and showing Chucky as a human, was also forced and kind of gave away the reveal scene. But overall, it's a Chucky movie. Don't go in with high standards.